and still get 800. So it's up the usual number of questions that fall into each of these categories. I've got a question here and I'll go through exactly what I meant by that strategy. Hello and welcome back or welcome to my channel. Thank you so much for clicking, I really appreciate it. For those of you that don't know, my name is Lotte and welcome to episode 3 of the shortest UCAT series you need to watch. This week it's decision making. So I feel like decision making is one of those sections that no one really loves but no one hates either. Unlike verbal reasoning, which we've covered, been there, done that, we don't need to talk about it again. The layout of this video will be an introduction into the structure of decision making, followed by a little bit about my own experience and then 5 tips that will help you with this section. To begin with, decision making includes 29 questions and you have 31 minutes to do them in, so it's roughly just over a minute for each question. However, most people don't stick to this as some questions are easier than others, and because there's so many different styles, people tend to have different strengths and weaknesses, so you may spend longer on some areas than others. According to Medic Portal, the average score for decision making tends to be about 6 to 9, so it falls roughly between verbal and quantitative reasoning, and hopefully this is reassuring to you. But you can get 6 questions wrong and still get 800. So basically, if there's a question style that you really aren't confident with, as long as you get 100% in the rest of decision making and you skip all of those questions, chances are you can still get a very high score. Decision making can be broken up into 6 different question styles. These include drawing conclusions, logical puzzles, interpreting information, Venn diagrams, probability, and evaluating arguments. On the screen, I'll put up the usual number of questions that fall into each of these categories. Now, this is only something I've heard from word of mouth, and it can just be used as a reference, but if you've heard otherwise, please do share in the comments as it could be helpful to others. Moving on to my experience, I actually really enjoyed this section and I found it quite methodical working through the questions. I especially liked evaluating arguments, however I struggled with Venn diagrams, but learning the basics of Venn diagrams and how they work really helped improve my score, and I would say that the scores I was getting in practice were fairly representative in the actual test. Now that I have sufficiently introduced you to decision making, if decision making was a person, they would probably be quite boring, not much drama going on, but there you go, you've met decision making. And now it's time for 5 tips to help you out with this section. Let's begin with tip number 1, work on your weak areas. So there are 6 different question types and the chances are you'll be really good at some and not so good at the others. So focus on your weak areas and don't just do all of the questions together, because with things like Medify, when you're doing sets of questions, you get a random shuffle of them. So if you're constantly getting the ones that you're good at, then you're not going to realize where you're falling behind in other areas. So make sure you're aware of your weaknesses. And with that being said, if you are using Medify, it's really helpful to go onto the analysis section and look through where you are falling behind in the separate sections, and that can help you to work on those questions and look at where you're making mistakes in those and allow you to identify patterns in the mistakes that you're making. Tip number 2, I think this is probably the most important tip of them all. Make use of the whiteboard. Seriously, use that whiteboard so much. Draw everything. Draw little flow charts, little doodles, whatever you need to try and understand the question. And I've said this in a previous video, but spend time making those doodles instead of rereading the question loads and loads, trying to understand it. And especially for the ones where you're drawing conclusions, it can be really helpful to make a little table to try and separate the different things or make a flowchart. Tip number 3, so this applies just to the drawing conclusions section, and this is the one where you get the 5 different yes or no questions. So I would really recommend using the MOO method that I described in the verbal reasoning video, and that's match, opposite, and outside info. So basically, instead of viewing the yes and no as yes and no, try and view it as a true or false question, and then use the match, opposite, and outside info method to answer the question. So obviously your no would basically be false or can't tell, and your yes would be the true. Tip number 4, this one applies to the Venn diagram and probability questions. It's really important that you understand the basics of how to do Venn diagrams and how to do probabilities. So I will very quickly run through one of the most obvious rules for each, and hopefully you'll find this helpful. However, there is others that would be worth having a look at. So for probability, if you're looking for x and y, then you need to multiply the probabilities. If you're looking for x or y, then you need to add the probabilities. Similarly, for Venn diagrams, if you're looking for x and y, then it will be in the overlap of the circles, and if you're looking for x or Y, then it will be in all of the circle. Lastly, tip number 5, this is related to the evaluating arguments section, which is where you're given a question and then you're given 4 different answers and you're asked to pick the strongest argument out of them. So usually there's a combination of for and against arguments, and essentially the strategy that I would advise you to use is to do the question in reverse. So begin by quickly scanning the question and then look at the answers and try and form a question that is related to each of the answers. And basically by doing this, you're training your brain to form a question that links to each section of the argument. And this is where students tend to go wrong, because they pick an argument that doesn't embody each part of the question. And quite often there tends to be a part that you need to look at the beginning and then maybe a twist at the end. And it's very easy to miss those little twists. So by creating a question for each answer, you're able to look for the one that links best. I'm concerned that that may have seemed a little bit confusing, and so I've got a question here and I'll go through exactly what I meant by that strategy. So this question is, should the television watershed, broadcasters only allowed to show explicit shows after 9 p.m, begin earlier in order to bring TV back to the forefront of British culture? Select the strongest argument from the statements below. So now that I've scanned the question, I'm going to have a look at the answers and try and form questions from those answers. So to begin with, there's yes, many older people go to bed before this time and therefore miss out on some of the better television. So if I saw this and I wanted to come up with a question for it, the question would be, do older people who go to bed early miss out on some of the better television? Of course, you can see this doesn't relate at all to the question, and so I would immediately just rule out that one. The second one is, yes, since the introduction of the watershed in 1964, television has shown a drastic decrease in popularity, strongly attributed to this occurring. So the question I would come up with that would be, did the watershed in 1964 decrease popularity of television viewing? And you can see that that links much more closely to the question stem that obviously talks about the watershed, and it talks about bringing TV back to the forefront of British culture. So although this doesn't actually talk about British culture specifically, it does make reference to 2 sections of that question, and I won't go through the other 2 because they also don't link at all to the question like the first one, but that's essentially what you're doing, and it can really help you narrow down. And even if you just use this method to eliminate answers, it can be very, very helpful. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you found those tips helpful. Please do share with anyone else who may also find this helpful, and stick around for the next few episodes of this mini series. Thank you again and have a lovely day.